Germany, April 1945. A United States Army sergeant found a young woman kneeling alone in the rubble of a bombed-out bakery. She was searching for grain with her bare hands. She weighed 78 pounds. He had a chocolate bar in his jacket pocket. What he did next violated military regulations, risked his career, and started something neither of them could have predicted. It began with 3 words that sounded like ownership but meant something else entirely. You're mine now. For 6 years, Europe had burned, cities had been unmade, armies had crossed and recrossed the same rivers, planting flags in rubble, calling it victory. Now, in the final weeks, something stranger than war had arrived. Silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion. The silence of a world that had forgotten what it was fighting for. In the German state of Saxony, spring came anyway, indifferent to the smoke still rising from the towns. The trees along the Elbe River turned green. Birds returned to branches above damaged rooftops. Life continued the way it always does, without asking permission. The town of Torgau sat on the western bank of the Elbe, 40 miles northeast of Leipzig. Before the war, it had been the kind of place that didn't appear on most maps. Small enough to be forgotten, old enough to have history in its stones. The Elbe moved slowly past its edges, wide and gray-green, carrying whatever the river chose to carry. By April of 1945, Torgau was a wound. The central square had taken 3 bombing raids. The church had lost its steeple. The school where children had once learned arithmetic and poetry now had no roof. The pharmacist's shop, the tailor, the hardware store, all of it compressed into irregular mountains of broken brick and splintered wood, as if the town had simply collapsed inward from grief. And in the ruins of what had been the finest bakery in Torgau, a young woman was slowly disappearing. Her name was Margaret Fischer. She was 23 years old. Before the war, people in Torgau had known her as the school teacher's daughter who became a school teacher herself. Reliable, precise, the kind of woman who arrived 5 minutes early and graded papers by lamplight. She had dark hair, worn pinned back the way practical women wore it, and eyes the color of pale winter sky, blue so light they sometimes looked almost white in certain kinds of morning light. Her father, Heinrich Fischer, had run the town bakery for 30 years. Not a glamorous establishment, not the kind of place written about in newspapers, but steady, always open, the smell of bread moving through the square on cold mornings like something alive and reassuring. What most people in Torgau didn't speak of openly, what they understood but left unspoken, was that Heinrich Fischer had not chosen to join the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In 1937, the Heil-Thüringen Business Guild, the organization that controlled commercial licensing in the region, had made it quietly clear to every small business owner in the area. Membership meant your license was renewed without difficulty. Non-membership meant paperwork, inspections, delays that could ruin a bakery dependent on daily flour deliveries. Heinrich had paid his dues. He had attended the meetings required of him. He had never marched, never cheered, never believed a single word. He had gone home after those meetings and sat at his kitchen table in silence for an hour the way a man sits after doing something that cost him. His wife, Elise, had understood. She had placed a cup of coffee in front of him and said nothing. That was its own form of courage. Their son Klaus had been conscripted in 1942 at the age of 19. He was 20 when he was lost on the Eastern Front in the fighting along the Dnieper River in the autumn of 1943, in the grinding campaign that consumed an entire generation of young German men in the mud and cold of the Soviet interior. The letter arrived in December 1943, 1 page. Official language. Regret to inform. Heinrich Fischer had held that letter for 3 days without speaking. The Wehrmacht requisitioned the bakery in late 1944, converting the ovens to some military purpose. Margaret was never told. Allied aircraft struck Torgau in February 1945. One of the bombs hit the bakery directly. Heinrich was in the cellar when it happened. The ceiling came down. The man who had baked bread for 30 years, who had paid dues to an organization he despised in order to keep feeding his neighbors, was gone in an instant, alone in the dark under 30 years of his own work. Elise Fischer stopped eating in March, not dramatically, not as a decision anyone could point to. She simply reduced what she consumed day by day the way a fire reduces when you stop adding wood. She passed away in her bed in the third week of March, quietly, in the way of someone who had decided that survival required more energy than she had left. Margaret buried her mother in the church cemetery with help from two elderly neighbors, using a shovel she found in what remained of a neighbor's shed. Then she was alone. By late April, she weighed 78 pounds. She had been living in the bakery cellar for weeks, distant each night into the space that still impossibly carried the ghost smell of flour and yeast. The walls remembered bread even when there was none. She had collected rainwater in a tin bucket positioned under a gap in the collapsed ceiling. She had found 3 potatoes buried in ash near the old stove and rationed them across 9 days, cutting each potato into pieces small enough to make her believe she was eating more than she was. Her reflection in a shard of broken mirror she'd found in the rubble was something she stopped looking at. The face that looked back had become a stranger, hollow at the cheeks, eyes too large for the face around them, hair that had once been thick and dark now brittle, the way plants go brittle when the water stops. She was not waiting to be rescued. She understood rescue was not coming. The war had taught her that understanding clearly that the world did not organize itself around individual survival. That history moved like weather, indifferent, and you either found shelter or you didn't. She was waiting, without quite knowing it, for herself to stop. On April 25, 1945, the 69th Infantry Division of the United States First Army reached the Elbe River at Torgau. What happened that day would become one of the most photographed moments of the Second World War. American soldiers and Soviet Red Army soldiers who had been fighting toward each other from opposite ends of Europe for years met on a destroyed bridge over the Elbe. They shook hands, they embraced, they held each other's flags. Photographs of that moment were printed in newspapers across the world. It was supposed to feel like the end. Sergeant William James Barker was 31 years old. He stood on the riverbank that afternoon and watched the photographs being taken, the handshakes, the flags, and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not joy, not relief, something closer to the feeling of finishing a very long sentence and discovering you no longer remember what it was about. He had been born on a wheat farm outside Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1914. He had grown up watching the sky the way farm children learn to watch it, for weather, for judgment, for the kind of information that doesn't appear in books. He had watched the Dust Bowl turn the Oklahoma sky brown in the 1930s, had seen neighbors pack their trucks and drive west with everything they owned, had learned early what it meant when the ground beneath you stopped giving. He had enlisted in 1943 and spent the following year training across Army bases in the American South. He had shipped to England in December of 1944, then crossed to France through the port of Le Havre in January 1945, when the war in Europe had perhaps 3 months left, but nobody knew that yet. He had moved east through the cold of a European winter that seemed to have no floor, through villages that had been fought over so many times they had stopped, looking like places people had lived. His closest friend, a man from Indiana named Robert Calloway, who had been planning to open a hardware store after the war, had been lost in a field outside Leipzig in March 1945, 3 weeks before the fighting ended, which was the particular cruelty of the final weeks, that men kept falling after the outcome was no longer in question. He had moved toward the Elbe through German towns that looked increasingly like Torgau, emptied, broken. The civilian population emerging from basements, blinking in the light like people who had been underground for years because they had. By April 25th, 1945, William Barker had seen enough of war to last a lifetime. His hands had a faint tremor he'd noticed in February and told no one about. He slept in fragments. He had stopped writing letters home in February, not because he had nothing to say, but because he could no longer find the words that would mean anything to people who hadn't been there. He was not a complicated man. He had been raised to be straightforward, to work hard, to say what he meant. He was not given to drama or self-examination. But something about the handshakes on the bridge that day, the photographs, the declared significance of the moment, sat wrong with him. He looked at the destroyed town behind him, at the smoke that still drifted from somewhere in its interior, at the people who had begun to emerge from wherever they had been sheltering, moving carefully through the streets as if the ground might not hold. This was victory. This broken place was what victory looked like. He lit a cigarette, noticed his hand shaking, put it out. The 69th Division established occupation positions in and around Torgau in the final days of April. Standard procedure followed, checkpoints established, civilians registered, military police deployed, supply depots set up in larger remaining structures. Corporal Daniel Reeves, 26 years old, from Flatbush, Brooklyn, was William's closest friend in the unit. He had joined the Army in 1942, served through the Italian campaign and the fighting across southern France with a different unit before being reassigned to the 69th in late 1944, and had developed in response to all of it a comprehensive and detailed skepticism about almost everything. He was small, dark-haired, fast-talking in the way of men who grew up in dense cities where speaking slowly meant losing your turn. He and William had been paired since arriving in France together. They complemented each other in the way that mismatched people sometimes do. William steady and quiet, Danny observant and sharp, each providing what the other lacked. Their conversations over months of service had covered farming, Brooklyn, baseball, the nature of luck, the existence of God, and the particular cruelty of Army-issue coffee. They had not talked much about what they had seen. Neither of them had the vocabulary for it yet. On the morning of April 29th, William and Danny were assigned routine patrol through the eastern section of Torgau. The streets were quiet in the way of places that have absorbed too much noise and gone silent on the other side of it. Rubble had been pushed to the edges in some areas. In others, entire blocks were simply gone, reduced to irregular landscapes that no longer resembled anything that had been built by people with intention. A dog moved through the far end of an alley and disappeared. Somewhere a child was crying, the sound coming from a direction impossible to determine. It was Danny who pointed first. Over there. William looked. In the square that had once been the center of Torgau, in front of the ruins of a building whose sign, barely readable, identified it as a bakery, a woman was kneeling in the rubble. She wasn't moving quickly. She wasn't searching with urgency. She was moving with the slow, methodical patience of someone who had been doing this for a long time, working her hands through the broken brick and ash in deliberate patterns, the way an archaeologist works, careful, systematic, committed. William stopped walking. He watched her for a full minute. She didn't look up. She moved a section of brick, sifted through what was beneath it with her fingers, moved to the next section. Her dress hung from her frame the way clothing hangs on wire, with nothing beneath it to give it shape. Her hair was unpinned, falling against the sides of a face he couldn't fully see. "What is she looking for?" Danny said. William didn't answer. He handed Danny his rifle and walked out across the square. She heard his boots on the broken ground, but didn't look up immediately. When she did, her eyes were startling. Pale blue, very light, too large in a face that had been reduced to essential structure. She looked at him with an expression that contained neither fear nor hope, just assessment, just a person looking at another person, deciding what they represented. He stopped a few feet from her. He said in English, What are you looking for?" She didn't understand the words, but something in his tone, which was careful, genuinely asking, without authority in it, seemed to register. She looked down at her hands. Then she held them up, palms open, showing him what she'd collected, a handful of dust and ash with fragments of grain mixed through it, pale slivers of something that had once been food. She held it up so he could see. Then she opened her fingers and let it fall. It fell through the April air the way sand falls. Gone before it reached the ground, William understood. He had grown up in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. He had watched crops fail. He had watched neighbors eat what should have been seed grain because there was nothing else. He knew what hunger looked like when it had moved past the point of crisis into something quieter and more final. He recognized it in her the way you recognize a language you learned young. He reached into his jacket. Standard issue D-ration chocolate bar, 4 ounces of compressed chocolate, oat flour, and skim milk powder, dense as a brick. Soldiers complained it tasted like nothing good. He had been keeping it in his inside pocket for 3 days, not eating it, not entirely sure why. He held it out to her. She looked at the chocolate bar the way people look at things they have stopped believing are real. Her hand stayed at her sides. Her eyes moved from the chocolate to his face and back to the chocolate. She had been taught for 12 years of a particular political education that American soldiers were a specific kind of threat. That occupation meant difficulty. That a gesture of apparent kindness from a former enemy was something to analyze before accepting. Her mind was doing that analysis now. He could see it happening. He took the bar back. He unwrapped it. He broke off a piece and put it in his own mouth, chewed it, let her watch. He held out the rest. The pause lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then her hand moved. Not a decision exactly, more like a response that her body made before her mind caught up with it. She took the chocolate. She looked at it in her palm. She brought it to her mouth. Her eyes closed. She forced herself to chew slowly. Her hands shook. Something moved across her face that was beyond the reach of language. Not gratitude, not relief, something more fundamental. The recognition of the body that it was not finished yet. He gave her the rest of the bar. He had 2 more in his pack. He gave her both. He sat in the rubble near her and said nothing while she ate, not watching in a way that would feel like observation. Just present, just there. When she finished, she was holding the empty wrappers in her hands, looking at them as though she was still working out what had happened. He stood. He said something she didn't understand, a few words in English, quiet, with no particular demand in them, and walked back across the square. Danny was exactly where he'd left him, watching. "You gave her your rations," Danny said. "She was starving. Bill." Danny looked back at the woman who hadn't moved. "They're all struggling. You cannot feed the whole country." William didn't say anything. He took back his rifle. They continued the patrol. But he was already thinking about the morning, about whether she would be there, about what he would bring. That evening, in the temporary mess area set up in what had been a Torgau warehouse, Danny sat across from William and watched him not eating his food. "You're thinking about her," Danny said. William didn't confirm or deny it. "It's not smart," Danny said. "You know the regs. Non-fraternization. They're not joking about it." The non-fraternization policy was Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067, issued in April 1945. It prohibited American military personnel from associating with German civilians beyond what was operationally necessary. The reasoning was understandable. This was a defeated enemy population, a society that required careful reconstruction, a context in which ordinary social interaction carried political weight. Violations could result in official reprimand, fines, or worse. "I know the regs," William said. "So?" William looked at his coffee. He thought about his mother's kitchen in Oklahoma, the way she had fed anyone who showed up at the door during the Depression. Drifters, neighbors who'd lost everything. His father would stand in the doorway and say, "Sadie, we don't have enough for everyone." And his mother would say, without looking up from what she was doing, "We have enough for one more." He hadn't thought about that in years. He wasn't sure why he was thinking about it now. "She was a teacher," he said finally. "Before, her whole family's gone." Danny was quiet for a moment. "A lot of people's families are gone, Bill." "I know." Danny looked at him for a long time. He had the particular quality of attention that comes from growing up in a place where reading people fast was a survival skill. He was reading William now. "Just be careful," Danny said. He picked up his coffee. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, be careful." William nodded. He finished his food without tasting it. And in the ruins of the bakery cellar across the broken town, in the dark that smelled of flour from another lifetime, Margaret Fischer lay on the floor with her eyes open, feeling something in her body that she didn't immediately recognize. It took her a long time to identify it. It was the faint, unfamiliar sensation of not being entirely empty. She looked at the ceiling in the dark. She thought about the soldier's face, the way he had eaten the chocolate first so she could see it was safe, the way he had sat in the rubble next to her without demanding anything, without explaining himself, without asking her to perform gratitude. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he'd done it. She thought, maybe tomorrow he comes back. Then she thought, I should not think that. Then she thought it again anyway. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning that followed for 3 weeks. There was no plan behind it, no strategy, no declared intention. He simply appeared in the square each day with food from the army mess, bread when he could get it, eggs twice, soup carried in a thermos he'd borrowed from the kitchen crew without explanation. He would find her in the square or near the bakery ruins, and he would sit nearby while she ate, and then he would leave. He didn't try to explain himself. She didn't ask him to. The silence between them in those first days was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had each, in their own way, run out of words. The months just past had done that to both of them through entirely different circumstances, arriving at the same result. She began to gain weight slowly, imperceptibly at first, then visibly. Her cheeks filled slightly. The gray quality left her skin. Her movements changed, less like something mechanical, more like something inhabited. She stood straighter. Her eyes, always that startling pale blue, began to hold more expression in them, as if something behind them was being gradually restored. William noticed all of it. He said nothing about it. He was not a man who narrated things, but he noticed. It was Herr Schmidt who made conversation possible. Ernst Schmidt was 54 years old, a retired schoolmaster who had taught mathematics and geography in Torgau for 22 years. He had come through the war by being old enough to avoid conscription and quiet enough to avoid attention. His English was imperfect, learned from books rather than people, which gave it a formal, slightly archaic quality that struck American soldiers as either charming or bewildering depending on the soldier. He appeared one morning near the square, watching William and Margaret with the careful attention of someone trying to understand what he was seeing. After a few minutes, he crossed the rubble, introduced himself to William in careful English, and offered, without being asked, to translate. William accepted. Through Schmidt, over several conversations across several days, William learned the framework of Margaret's life, her name, her age, her profession, the arc of loss, the brother on the Eastern Front, the father in the cellar, the mother who faded in March like, as Schmidt translated her words, a photograph left in the sun. He also learned something Schmidt mentioned almost as an aside, in the careful way that people mention things they consider important, but don't want to emphasize. He mentioned that Margaret's father, Heinrich Fischer, had been the chairman of the Torgau Business Guild, a man known throughout the town as decent and fair, who had joined the NSDAP in 1937 only because the licensing authority had left him no practical choice, who had paid his dues, and attended his required meetings in the manner of a man serving a sentence he hadn't earned. Schmidt said this with the particular precision of someone who understood that these details might matter later in ways neither of them could yet see. William filed it away. He wasn't sure why. On the 8th morning, Margaret spoke to him directly, not through Schmidt, who wasn't present, not in German, which William wouldn't have understood. In English, assembled carefully from the small collection of phrases she had been quietly accumulating. She had been watching American soldiers for 8 days. She had listened to their conversations from a distance, the way she had once listened to radio broadcasts for patterns, for structure, for the internal logic of a language she could eventually map. William was sitting on a section of collapsed wall near the bakery ruins, eating an apple, not looking at her particularly. She was 3 feet away. She said, "You come every day." He stopped chewing, looked at her. "Yes, why?" It wasn't framed as a question. It was an observation with a space after it, waiting. He thought about it. He was a man who took questions seriously, who didn't answer before he had an answer. "Because you needed help," he said. "That's all." She looked at him for a long time. Her expression was doing something complicated that he couldn't fully read. In Germany, in the years she had grown up in, the idea that a person would help another person simply because that person needed help, without calculation, without expectation, without positioning, had become almost theoretical. The system she had lived inside rewarded loyalty to the system. Everything else was transactional. "That is all?" she said. "That's all." She looked away. She looked at the ruins of the bakery, at the place where the ovens had been, where her father had stood every morning before dawn for 30 years, where the smell of bread had moved out into the square and through the streets of a town that no longer existed. She said quietly, in German something Schmidt wasn't there to translate. William didn't understand the words, but the weight behind them was clear enough. 2 days later, she asked him the question he hadn't expected. They were sitting in the square. Schmidt was present that day, sitting slightly apart, available but not intrusive. The afternoon was warm, the first real warmth of the year, the kind that makes places look almost normal. Margaret looked at William directly. She said, in the German that Schmidt translated word by word, "Have you lost people close to you?" Danny, who happened to be passing on the far side of the square on his way back from a supply point, stopped when he heard Schmidt's translation. He stood at the edge of the square, not approaching, watching. William didn't look away from her. "Yes," he said. Schmidt translated. "Do you carry it with you?" she said. William was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of thought, but the opposite. "Every day," he said. "But I've learned that carrying something doesn't mean it stops you from moving forward." Schmidt translated. She held that answer in her expression for a moment, turned it over. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would photograph well. Subtly, the shift that happens when a person receives information that changes a frame they'd been working inside. She nodded once. It was not absolution. It was not resolution. It was something more functional than either of those things. It was recognition. Two people on opposite sides of a war that had made difficult things of everyone, acknowledging to each other that they had both been inside something enormous and were both still here. On the far side of the square, Danny watched this exchange. He watched William's face during it. He watched Margaret's face. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he continued walking, not saying anything, in the way of a man who has just had an opinion revised against his intention. The difficulty arrived on a Tuesday evening in the second week of May. William was walking Margaret back toward the boarding house, a partially repaired structure 2 streets from the square where a local woman, Frau Holzer, had begun housing displaced civilians in exchange for whatever work they could provide. It was getting dark. The occupation curfew was in an hour. They were walking without speaking, which had become their comfortable default. Captain Harold Steins of the military police stepped out of a doorway with two enlisted men behind him. Steins was 40 years old, from Philadelphia, professionally thorough in the way of men who derive their sense of order from the existence of rules. He had been tracking William's daily visits to the square for 5 days. He had the look of a man who had been waiting for an appropriate moment. Sergeant Barker. Not a greeting, a deposition. William stopped. Margaret stopped beside him. Sir, this woman. Steins looked at Margaret with the assessing neutrality of a man processing a situation rather than seeing a person. You're aware of JCS 1067. I am, sir. Then you understand that what I've been observing for the better part of a week constitutes a violation of. She's an intelligence source, sir. The words arrived before William had fully decided to say them. He heard them come out of his own mouth and committed to them in the same instant, because there was nothing else to do. Steins's eyes narrowed. Explain. She has information about former SS personnel who were in this area before we arrived. She's been providing me with details on a staging location east of town. I've been cultivating the contact, sir, per standard intelligence protocol. It was the kind of statement that was specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be impossible to immediately disprove. Steins was not an intelligence officer. He was a military policeman. The jurisdictions were different. He looked at Margaret, at William, at Margaret again. I'll be verifying this with your commanding officer, Sergeant. Of course, sir. Steins and his men left. Margaret had understood almost nothing of the English exchange, but she had understood the shape of it. She had understood that William had said something to redirect the other soldier, and that whatever he'd said had been improvised, and that it had cost him something. She looked at him. He looked back. I'll explain tomorrow, he said. With Schmidt. She nodded. She walked the rest of the way to the boarding house alone. He stood on the street and thought about what he'd just done. He had made a claim to his superior officer that was not entirely true. That was one problem. The other problem was that he now needed it to become true, or close enough to true that it wouldn't destroy him when Steins followed through. He walked back to camp in the dark, thinking. The next morning, through Schmidt, he told Margaret exactly what he had said to the captain and exactly why. She listened to Schmidt's translation without expression. When it was finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You spoke for me, she said. I said something that needed to become true. Schmidt translated. Margaret's expression shifted, not softened, complicated. Then she said something that surprised him. She said, it can become true. Through Schmidt, she told him about the final days before Torgau fell, about her neighbor, a woman named Frau Brandt, whose husband had been a Waffen-SS Oberscharführer. She had overheard a conversation 3 days before the Americans arrived. Brandt's husband and 2 other men discussing a gathering point east of town, a farmstead, she thought, maybe 6 kilometers, near a road that ran alongside a stand of pines. She had not thought to tell anyone. She had not believed anyone would listen. She had not been sure it mattered. The conflict was ending. Everyone knew it was ending. But she had heard it. She remembered it clearly. Details had always stayed in her. It was a quality that had made her good at teaching. William brought this information to his commanding officer the same afternoon. He presented it as developed intelligence from a cultivated local source, which was, in a technical sense, what it had become. A patrol was organized. 2 days later, 3 former Waffen-SS soldiers were found at a farmstead 6 kilometers east of Torgau, exactly where Margaret had indicated. The credit went to William. His CO mentioned it approvingly. Captain Steins filed no further complaint, but William understood what had actually happened. Margaret had not just provided information. She had, by providing accurate information at genuine personal risk, placed her safety entirely in his hands. If anyone in the remaining German civilian population learned she had assisted American forces in locating former SS personnel, Her situation in Torgau would become difficult in ways that had nothing to do with hunger. She had done it anyway. That evening, he went back to the boarding house and stood on the street until she came to the window. He didn't say anything. He just looked up at her. She looked back down at him. Neither of them spoke. But something had been established between them that went beyond whatever had been established before, a different kind of trust, the kind that comes not from shared comfort, but from shared risk. The 3 weeks remaining before William's unit was due to leave Torgau passed the way the last hours of anything pass, too quickly and with too much weight. They spent nearly every free afternoon together, with Schmidt present when necessary, without him when they had developed enough shared language to manage without. Margaret's English improved rapidly. She had always been a fast learner. It was the quality that had made her a good teacher and a good student simultaneously. William's German remained limited but expanded. He could ask her if she was all right. He could tell her she looked better. She could tell him about the town before the war, about her students, about the way the bread had smelled in the mornings before everything changed. She told him about Klaus. She described him as a young man who had been quietly afraid of dogs, but had never told anyone, who had been good at mathematics, who had written letters home from the Eastern Front that said nothing about what was actually happening because he didn't want their mother to worry. She did not break down when she told this. She had processed her grief somewhere in the long winter just past. What was left was a kind of steady knowing, the knowledge of what had been, carried without drama, because drama had nothing to add. William told her about Robert Calloway, about the European winter, about the particular quality of those final weeks, moving through a country that was already surrendering in pieces, while individual moments of danger still appeared without warning. He told her that Robert had been from a small town in Indiana, that he had been planning to open a hardware store after the war, that William had never spoken of this to anyone before because saying it felt like it might finally make the loss permanent. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without moving to fill silence. "He sounds like he was a good man," she said. "He was." She nodded once. Klaus, too. They sat with that for a while. 2 absences, present in a scarred square in Germany in the spring of a year when the world was beginning slowly to remember what peace meant. In the 3rd week of May, Danny Reeves did something William didn't expect. He showed up at the square on a Sunday afternoon, his day off, his own time, and sat down near where William and Margaret were talking. He had a pack of playing cards. He dealt them out on a flat section of rubble, 3 hands, looked at both of them, and said, "You two play cards?" Margaret looked at William. William looked at Danny. "You deal from the bottom," William said. "Everybody deals from the bottom," Danny said. "That's what the bottom is for." It was the first time William heard Margaret laugh. Not a full laugh, a short, startled sound, quickly contained, like something escaping before she could stop it. But real, unmistakably real. Danny looked at her. A small evaluation crossed his face. Fast, practiced, Brooklyn quick. Then he dealt the cards with elaborate seriousness, explained the rules of gin rummy in slow, simple English while Margaret tracked his hands, and they played for 2 hours in the afternoon light among the ruins of a German town. That evening, walking back to camp, Danny said, "She's all right." "I know," William said. "I mean it. She's all right." A pause. "What are you going to do?" William looked at the road ahead of him. The question had been present for weeks. He had been examining it from different angles the way you examine structural damage, trying to understand what was still load-bearing and what had already given way. "I'm working on it," he said. Danny didn't push. That was the thing about Danny. He knew when to leave space. On a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of June, William found Margaret sitting on the front step of the bakery ruins. Not working, not searching, just sitting, looking at nothing. He sat down beside her. After a while, he saw that her face was wet. Not weeping, There was no movement to it, no sound. Just tears, the way water sometimes moves through stone. Her body releasing something that had been held for too long, under too much pressure. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for her. He just sat. He had learned across these weeks that this was what she needed more than anything else he could provide. Not words, not action, not explanation or comfort or the performance of understanding, just presence, just someone remaining beside her without requiring anything from the moment. He sat beside her for 40 minutes. At the end of it, she said in quiet English, "When you leave, I will have nothing again." The words settled in him with a weight that was physical. He had been not thinking about leaving for 2 weeks. The unit had received notice, early July, France, then home. He would be gone, and she would be here in this changed town, alone again, stronger than she had been, but structurally alone in a way that strength couldn't fix. He looked at her. The evening light was doing what evening light does in that part of Germany in June, turning everything gold and then amber and then the particular gray-blue of dusk over water. "Come with me," he said. She looked at him. "When I leave, come with me to America." She didn't say anything. He could see her working through what he meant. She knew enough English now to understand the words. It was the reality of the words she was processing. "How?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'll find a way." He spent the next 4 days finding out whether it was possible. He talked to Chaplain Robert Morrison first. Morrison was 41 years old, originally from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, a man who had performed services in difficult places throughout the campaign, in open fields, in partially standing buildings, in all the places where the usual comforts of faith were unavailable. He had a practical approach. He believed in the fundamental importance of trying to do the right thing, and he had a corresponding tolerance for situations that weren't quite within standard parameters. He had performed, Morrison told William without particular emphasis, 11 marriages between American servicemen and European women since arriving in France. He understood the bureaucratic path. He also told William the clear truth. There was no simple mechanism for a German national, specifically a German national whose father appeared on a party membership list, regardless of circumstances, to enter the United States as the wife of an American soldier. War Brides Act provisions, signed into law in December of 1945, would apply primarily to Allied nationals. Germans were a different category. Margaret's path, if there was one, ran through the Office of Military Government, United States, OMGUS. An application would require documentation of her identity, her background, her wartime situation. It would require an investigation. That investigation would find Heinrich Fischer's name on the NSDAP membership roll of the Heil-Thüringen Business Guild. That finding would require explanation and supporting evidence. It was not impossible, Morrison said, but it was specific. It required documentation. It required witnesses who could speak to the nature of Heinrich Fischer's membership. William thought of Schmidt. He proposed to Margaret on June 20th, 1945, in the ruins of her family's bakery. No ring, no prepared speech. He had thought about both and concluded that neither of them would be honest, and that honesty was the only thing he had to offer that was worth anything. Margaret, he said her name the way he had learned to say it, with the hard G, the short A, will you marry me and come to Oklahoma? She said yes before the sentence was finished, not impulsively, with the certainty of someone who had already answered the question in private and was now confirming it in public. He had never been so relieved in his life. He hadn't known that until it happened. The wedding took place on June 27, 1945, in a small Lutheran church on the western edge of Torgau that had come through the bombing with its walls and roof intact, though the windows were all gone, replaced with boards that let in thin lines of light like something described in a religious text. Chaplain Morrison presided. He spoke in English, then German, then English again, moving between languages with the ease of someone who understood that the words mattered less than the intention behind them. Margaret wore a dress provided by Red Cross volunteers, blue-gray, simple. It fit her in the way clothes fit people who have recently changed. Not quite right, but close enough. Her hair was pinned back. She stood straight. William wore his dress uniform. He had polished his boots the night before in the dark of the tent because it was the only concrete thing he could do to prepare. The witnesses were Corporal Daniel Reeves and Herr Ernst Schmidt. Danny stood on William's left with his hands clasped in front of him and the expression of a man who is refusing to show emotion as a matter of principle. He had borrowed a clean shirt from somewhere. He had combed his hair, which he virtually never did. When Morrison asked if anyone present had objection to the union, Danny said quietly but clearly, to no one in particular, "No, we're good." Morrison appeared not to hear this. Schmidt appeared to be translating it to himself and finding it adequate. When the ceremony reached its conclusion, William took both of Margaret's hands in his. He looked at her face. He said in English, "You're mine now." Schmidt translated. In German, the phrase carried slightly differently, protective rather than possessive, a declaration of responsibility rather than ownership. Margaret held his eyes. She understood both the English and the German. She understood what he meant. In a world that had spent 6 years systematically destroying the structures that made people safe, he was telling her she was now inside a structure he intended to maintain. She nodded. Then she said, in careful English, "And you are mine." Schmidt didn't need to translate that. Danny looked at the boards covering the empty windows and pressed his lips together and said nothing. The paperwork began immediately, and it was immediately complicated. William brought the application to Morrison the next morning. Morrison walked him through the OMJUIS process with the patience of a man who had navigated it before. The application required Margaret's full biographical documentation, birth record, family history, employment background. It required a statement of her wartime situation. It required a formal accounting of her father's organizational affiliations. That last requirement was the difficulty. Heinrich Fischer's name appeared on the NSDAP membership list of the Heil-Thüringen Business Guild, year of entry 1937. On paper, he was a party member. On paper, that membership made Margaret's application vulnerable to denial at the investigative stage. William brought this to Schmidt. He asked directly, could Schmidt provide a written statement under his own name and responsibility attesting to the stature of Heinrich Fischer's membership, to the fact that it was required by economic circumstance, to the fact that Fischer had never participated politically, had never expressed ideological alignment, had been known throughout Torgau as a man who complied because he had no choice and went no further. Schmidt sat with this request for a full day. He came back the following morning and said yes. He said it in the formal, deliberate English of a man making a commitment he understood fully. He said, Heinrich Fischer was a good man who was given a difficult choice and chose to protect his family. I will say this with my name on it. He wrote the statement himself in German with a German to English translation alongside. He signed it. Morrison witnessed it, and a JAG officer attached to the division stamped it with the official seal required for OMJUIS documentation. It was submitted with the application as supporting evidence. There was nothing left to do but wait, and Williams' unit was leaving in 8 days. Their last nights in Torgau had the quality that last things always have. Each moment slightly overlit, slightly too present, the knowledge of its ending making it both more real and less bearable. They sat in the square each evening. The town was changing slowly around them. Rubble had been cleared from more streets. The sound of hammering came from 2 blocks over, where a family was working to make one room of their house livable again. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing an accordion, a sound so ordinary that it seemed almost startling given everything. I will send for you, William said, as soon as the papers clear. As soon as you can travel, I will send for you." "I will wait," Margaret said. Her English had become something genuine now, her own, not borrowed. "I will stay strong." "I promised." "Write to me every week." "I will write every week." He gave her everything practical he had, money in whatever combination of currency was useful, ration cards, contact information for the Red Cross administrators and the OMGUS office in Leipzig, a list of names and addresses written in both English and German. He made sure she had a secure place in the boarding house through the end of the year. He arranged a conversation between Frau Holzer and a sympathetic American quartermaster sergeant who could ensure Frau Holzer's own supply situation remained stable, a transaction that was technically outside his authority and practically essential. He thought of his mother. "We have enough for one more." The morning his unit shipped out, he found Margaret waiting at the convoy's assembly point. She was wearing the blue-gray dress from the wedding. Her hair was pinned back. She stood very straight. His sergeant allowed 90 seconds. He held her face in both his hands. He looked at her the way you look at something you are trying to keep, taking in each detail, committing it to a place in the mind where it wouldn't fade. "I love you," he said. He had not said it before. He meant it the way a man means something he has been certain of for weeks and is saying aloud for the first time. She said it back in English, her own voice, her own words. Then he was in the truck. The convoy began moving. The dust rose behind it. She stood on the road with one hand raised. He watched her get smaller. He watched the distance take her. He watched until there was nothing to watch. He turned forward and looked at the road ahead of him, and he did not allow himself to think about anything for a long time. Summer became autumn. Margaret worked for the American Occupation Administration as a translator and clerk, a position that required her English, her German, her patience with bureaucratic process, and her capacity to move between the world the Americans were building and the world the Germans were trying to recover. She was good at it. She had always been good at being the person in the middle, the one who understood both sides of something and translated not just language, but meaning. She wrote to William every week, as promised. Long letters, precise and detailed in the way of someone who has learned that precision is a form of care, describing her days, her progress with the paperwork, the state of the town, the first shop that reopened on the main street, the family that had returned and was raising a wall on a house that had been open to the sky since February. His letters came back irregularly. Mail from America was slow, unreliable, routed through systems managing the logistics of returning an entire army to civilian life. When his letters arrived, she read them until she had memorized them. He described the farm, the wheat fields, the red dirt roads, his mother's kitchen with its wood stove, his father's reserved acknowledgement that a letter had been received and that things appeared to be proceeding. He sent photographs, the farmhouse, the barn, the fields. She kept them in a tin box under her bed in the boarding house. The winter of 1945 into 1946 was one of the most difficult in European memory. Fuel was desperately scarce. Food remained strictly rationed. The official caloric allocation for German civilians that winter fell below minimum subsistence levels in several regions. People suffered from cold and hunger in cities that had come through the bombing intact. Margaret endured. She was stronger than she had been. The young woman who had weighed 78 pounds in April, who had knelt in rubble searching for grain with the patience of someone who had stopped expecting to find it, was no longer that person. That person had been replaced by someone who knew precisely how to navigate a bureaucratic system, who could read the mood of an American officer across a desk and calibrate her approach accordingly, who understood that persistence was a skill and that skills could be refined. She did not think of this as resilience. She thought of it as the necessary minimum. In February 1946, 9 months after William had left, the letter arrived. It was from the OMGUS administrative office in Leipzig, It was formal, official, 3 paragraphs. It said that her visa application had been approved, that travel arrangements would be coordinated through military channels, that she would travel by train to Bremerhaven, by ship to New York, by train to Oklahoma. She read it 3 times in the hallway of the boarding house. Then she sat down on the floor because there was no furniture in the hallway, and the feeling that moved through her was too large to manage standing up. Deep, shaking, completely real. The release of a person who had held something together through an impossibly long time and was now finally permitted to put it down. Frau Holzer came out of the kitchen and found her there. She sat down on the floor next to her without asking any questions. She put an arm around her. They sat on the floor of the hallway together, 2 women of different generations, and Frau Holzer said nothing because there was nothing to say, and she understood this. After a while, Margaret said, "I can go." Frau Holzer nodded. "Then go," she said. "There is nothing left here that needs you." The day before she left, Margaret went back to the bakery. Spring was arriving early. The first small flowers were pushing through the rubble, yellow, impossibly cheerful, indifferent to context. She walked to the square. She stood where she had stood in April, almost exactly a year before. The rubble had shifted, cleared in some places, settled in others. The geography of what had been lost had changed but not resolved. She knelt down. She put her hand on the broken bricks. She stayed that way for a long time. She said goodbye to her father in the way that people say goodbye to people who are no longer there to hear it. She said goodbye to her mother. She said goodbye to Klaus, who had been quietly afraid of dogs and gifted at mathematics and 20 years old when he was lost in the cold of the Soviet interior. She said, "I am going to America now. I am going to live." Then she stood up. She brushed the dust from her hands. She walked back to the boarding house. She packed what she had, which fit into 1 bag. She was on the train to Bremerhaven before noon. The Atlantic took 12 days. Margaret was unwell for most of the crossing, not dramatically, not the kind of sickness that requires attention or generates sympathy. A quiet, persistent nausea that came from the motion of the ship and the smell of the lower decks, and possibly from the accumulated tension of 9 months of waiting, finally meeting the reality of motion. She spent the days on deck when the weather allowed, standing at the rail, watching the ocean, which was larger than she had imagined and grayer and more indifferent. She had brought the tin box. It was in her bag, wrapped in the only sweater she owned. Inside it, William's letters, the photographs of the farm, Schmidt's signed statement that had helped clear her father's name, and the empty wrappers from the 3 D-ration chocolate bars from April of 1945. She had kept them without deciding to. At some point, they had simply become something she kept. The other passengers on the lower decks were women like her, mostly. War brides, the Americans called them, a phrase that compressed an enormous range of human experience into 2 words and a category. They were French women and Dutch women and British women, and a smaller number of German women who tended to sit slightly apart from the others, not from preference, but from the social physics of recent history. They were all going to places they had never been, to families who would assess them across kitchen tables, to lives whose shape they could not yet see. Margaret did not speak much to the other women. She was not unfriendly. She simply had a way of being present that didn't require conversation. She sat at the rail and watched the water and thought about Oklahoma, which she had only seen in photographs, about wheat fields and red dirt roads and a farmhouse with a wraparound porch, about a man who had eaten a chocolate bar in front of her to prove it was safe and had somehow, through that small gesture and every gesture that followed, become the architecture of her future. She thought about what she would say when she saw him. She had composed sentences in her head for 9 months. All of them, when she examined them in the gray light of the Atlantic, seemed inadequate. She decided eventually that she would say nothing prepared. that she would wait to see what the moment required. New York Harbor appeared on a March morning through fog and early light. She was standing at the rail when it came into view. She had been standing there for an hour because she hadn't wanted to miss it, because it seemed important to see the approach rather than arrive in the middle of it. The Statue of Liberty emerged from the mist the way large things emerge from mist, gradually, the scale clarifying slowly, the reality of its size arriving after the image. She had seen photographs. Every European had seen photographs. But the photographs had failed to communicate the thing that photographs always fail to communicate, which is presence, the weight of a thing actually existing in space. She held the rail and looked at it until it was passed. Ellis Island processed her with the bureaucratic efficiency of an institution that had processed millions, questions, documents, stamps. The clerk who handled her file was a tired man in his 50s who looked at Margaret Fischer Barker's papers, found them in order, and handed them back with a stamp and a nod. No ceremony, no recognition of what it had taken to produce those papers and the person holding them. She was documented. She was Mrs. William Barker, permanent resident, bound for Oklahoma. The train from New York took 3 days. She watched America through the window the way she had watched the ocean, steadily, with full attention. The cities first, dense and vertical and loud even from inside glass. Then farmland, the scale of it, nothing like Germany. Fields that went on past the point where she expected them to end, continuing beyond that point and beyond it again. Mountains she hadn't expected in the east. Plains in the middle of the country that were so flat and so open that the sky seemed to take up most of the available space, pressing down from above with the confident authority of something that has never had to compete. She pressed her hand against the window glass and felt the cold of it against her palm. Outside, America kept arriving. She thought about the cellar in Torgau, about the smell of flour in walls that hadn't held flour for years. She thought about how impossible this moment would have seemed to the woman who had knelt in that square. How completely unimaginable. That woman had been running out of reasons to continue. She was on a train crossing America. The distance between those two facts was not something she had words for. William was on the platform at Tulsa when the train arrived on March 15, 1946. She saw him before he saw her. He was in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a plain jacket, a hat he'd pushed back on his head the way men push hats back when they're looking for something. He was scanning the passengers coming off the train with the focused attention of a man who is trying not to show how tightly wounded he is. He was thinner than she remembered, or differently thin, not the thinness of hardship, but the thinness of a man who had been working physical labor and sleeping better than he had in years. He looked older. He also, when he finally saw her step onto the platform, looked suddenly younger. The expression that crossed his face was the expression of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down. He crossed the platform. She walked toward him. They stopped in front of each other and for a moment just looked, confirming, making sure the person was real and not a product of 9 months of letters and photographs and carefully maintained memory. Then he pulled her in and she let herself be held, and the platform continued around them with its ordinary motion of arrivals and departures, completely indifferent the way platforms are. "You made it," he said against her hair. "I promised I would wait," she said. "I promised I would stay strong." He held her tighter for a moment. Then he held her away from him to look at her face. He checked it against the version he had been carrying in his memory and found it more real than the memory had been. "You look good," he said. "You look old," she said. He laughed. It was the right thing to say. She had known it would be. The drive to the farm took an hour on roads the color of rust. She watched it all. The sky was the thing that kept requiring her attention. It was so large, so actively blue, so uninterrupted by the topography of anything. In Germany, the sky was portioned by hills and forests and the density of old settlement. Here it simply existed, full and uncontested, from one edge of vision to the other. The wheat was just beginning to green. Winter wheat, William told her, planted in the fall, dormant through the cold, coming back now. The fields stretched away from the road in both directions, the color of the earliest possible green, the color of something just beginning. She thought of her father, 30 years of bread, all of it starting like this, as a green field and a season's faith that what was planted would come back. The farmhouse was exactly the photographs: white clapboard, wraparound porch, a barn behind it, larger than it had appeared in the pictures. Flowers planted along the front that weren't blooming yet, just green in tension, waiting for enough warmth. Sarah Barker was on the porch, 60 years old, gray hair pulled back with practical efficiency. Apron dusted with flour, she had been baking, Margaret realized, and had come outside when she heard the truck and hadn't thought to take the apron off or hadn't cared. She was a woman who didn't perform anything. She looked at Margaret coming up the porch steps with a farmer's wife's frank assessment, the kind that sees what's actually there rather than what's expected or feared. Then she smiled. "Welcome home," she said. Home, the word arrived in Margaret's chest before it reached her mind. Sarah took her hands, both of them, and held them for a moment in the way of a woman, confirming something she had decided before this meeting. Then she led her inside. James Barker Sr. was in the kitchen. He was 62 years old, broad in the way of men who have done physical work all their lives, with a face that had been shaped by Oklahoma sun and wind into something permanent and considered. He nodded to Margaret when she came in. He shook her hand. He said, "Ma'am," in a voice that was neutral in the way of someone being very careful to be neutral. His reserve was present in the room the way furniture is present, not hostile, structural. He was a man from a particular place and a particular generation, and that place and generation had recently spent several difficult years in conflict with Germany, and his son had come home from that time having married a German woman, and he was going to need time to make that into something he fully understood. Margaret understood this. She had been a teacher. She knew how to read a room. She knew the difference between opposition and adjustment. She said, "Mr. Barker, thank you for having me in your home." He nodded again. He went back to whatever he had been doing. William's sister Alice was 17, and she was the opposite of her father in every way that could be measured in a first meeting. She had questions the way fires have warmth, naturally, continuously, as a fundamental quality of their nature. She asked Margaret about Germany, about the war, about what German food tasted like, about whether German schools were different from American schools, about what it had been like to grow up there. Margaret answered carefully. She translated her experience into words a 17-year-old could receive. She left out the weight and the darkness and the specific quality of silence in a cellar that smells of flour from a life that no longer exists. She gave Alice the surface of it, which was still more than most people in Torgau had been willing to say to each other. That evening, Sarah made a meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread. It appeared on the table in quantity that seemed, to Margaret's recent experience, almost extraordinary. Not excessive by any standard of abundance, but more food in one meal than she had managed across many days during the worst of the winter just past. She sat at the table surrounded by William's family and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. It was not comfort exactly, and it was not happiness exactly, and it was not safety exactly, though it contained elements of all three. It was something quieter, the sensation of a door that has been standing open for too long finally being allowed to close. William reached over under the table and took her hand. She held it. James Barker Sr., across the table, looked at his plate and ate his dinner and said very little, but he refilled her glass of water without being asked, and she noticed this, and she understood it for what it was. That night, In the bedroom that was now theirs, she allowed herself to release what she had been holding. William sat beside her and said nothing and asked for no explanation. Some things are not about anything specific. They are about everything accumulated. She had been keeping herself upright through so much and for so long that the simple physical fact of being somewhere safe was too much for the body to absorb quietly. When it passed, she lay in the dark, listening to the Oklahoma night, which was so quiet compared to anything she'd known in the last year that it was almost loud in its own way. "Is it always this quiet?" she asked. "Always," William said. She was asleep before she had time to decide how she felt about that. The first year was harder than she had expected, and she had expected it to be hard. Language was the first barrier. Not because she didn't know English, she did well enough, but Oklahoman English was a different instrument than the careful, formal English she had learned in Torgau. The vowels had been stretched and reshaped by geography. Words ran together. Phrases meant things their component words didn't suggest. She would ask William to repeat something, and he would repeat it the same way, slightly louder, which was never the problem. Sarah helped. She spoke slowly without making the slowness condescending. She explained expressions with the patience of a woman who understood that language is a country you have to enter gradually. The second barrier was the community. People in town knew William had married a German woman. In a small town, information of this kind travels with the efficiency of weather. Reactions were not uniform. Some neighbors came to the farm with food and welcome in the first weeks. A casserole, a pie, a wave from a truck. Others were cold in the way of people who have made a decision and are not prepared to revisit it. A woman at the feed store, when she understood who Margaret was, refused to serve her and said something Margaret understood completely. Sarah Barker stepped in front of her daughter-in-law. "This is my family," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet. It had the quality of something that has decided not to be loud because volume would be unnecessary. "You'll treat her with respect, or we'll take our business to Tulsa." They left. They took their business to Tulsa twice before the situation at the feed store was no longer an issue. That evening, Margaret asked William if he regretted it, bringing her here. He looked at her with an expression she had learned to read. The expression of a man who is going to say exactly what he means. "Never," he said, "not for 1 second." She believed him. That was not nothing. She put her whole self into building something that could last in this place. She studied English for hours each day, attending to the specific Oklahoma ways of speaking until they became available to her, if not entirely natural. She learned to cook Sarah's way, the particular combinations that had seemed unfamiliar at first and became, over time, something she found genuine satisfaction in. She attended the First Baptist Church every Sunday, which was not her tradition, which was more openly emotional than the Lutheran services she had grown up with, and which required adjustments she made without complaint. She volunteered at the school. She helped organize a summer fundraising event. She brought pies to neighbor families when illness kept them from their own kitchens, because it was the right thing to do, and because her father had once been the person whose bread fed his neighbors, and she understood that obligation as something that ran in the family. People adjusted, slowly, unevenly, the way adjustments happen in small communities where memory is long and change arrives through accumulated small evidence rather than declared moments. She became less the German war bride and more Mrs. Barker, William's wife, the woman who brought food when you were ill and helped at the school and spoke with an accent that had become, over months, something familiar rather than foreign. James Barker Sr. remained reserved, polite. He passed the butter when she needed it. He held the door. He said good morning and good night. But warmth was not yet there, and she did not push it. She understood that some distances closed on their own timeline. In the autumn of 1946, she discovered she was expecting. She told William in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning. He was having coffee before going out to the fields. He put the coffee down. He looked at her. He sat back down. Then he smiled. It was the smile she had first seen at the Tulsa train station, the one that made him look 10 years younger than he was. The news moved through the household with its own energy. Sarah's response was immediate and practical. She began preparing the spare bedroom. Alice's response was immediate and enthusiastic. She began suggesting names from a list she appeared to generate from thin air in about 4 minutes, presenting it at dinner with the earnestness of a person who believes the naming of a child is among the most significant decisions a family will make. James Barker Sr. said nothing that evening. He finished his dinner. He went out to the porch in the way he did some evenings to sit and look at the fields in the last light. Later, Margaret saw him through the kitchen window. He was standing at the porch rail, his back to the house, looking at the wheat fields in the growing dark. He stood there for a long time. She couldn't see his face. They debated names for weeks, American names, German names, the possible bridges between them. They wanted something that could carry both worlds without being crushed by either. They settled on James for William's father, Friedrich as a middle name for Heinrich Fischer, who had made bread for 30 years and paid dues he didn't believe in and had given his life in a cellar and deserved to have his name go forward into the future he hadn't lived to see. James Friedrich Barker. He was born in February 1947 during an ice storm that sealed the roads and made the doctor's arrival impossible. Sarah delivered the baby. She had done it before. On farms, professional help is sometimes theoretical. She was calm in the specific, steady way of women who have learned that calm is not the absence of urgency, but its best management. She gave instructions in English. Margaret responded in German. The language barrier dissolved under the more fundamental requirements of the moment. William stayed in the kitchen. He drank coffee he didn't taste. He walked the length of the room until he knew it in the dark. Danny had said something to him once about the particular quality of waiting when there is nothing useful to do, that it requires its own kind of endurance. William understood this now in a way he hadn't before. Then the baby made his first sound, clear, immediate, definitive. The arrival of a new person. Sarah held out his son. He took him. James Friedrich Barker. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, born in an ice storm on an Oklahoma farm, the grandson of a German baker and an Oklahoma farmer, the son of a school teacher from Torgau and a sergeant from the 69th Infantry Division who had once eaten half a chocolate bar in front of a woman he didn't yet know to prove it was safe. He looked at Margaret. She was exhausted in the way of someone who has just accomplished something enormous. She looked back at him. He could not find words adequate to the moment, so he said nothing. He held his son and looked at his wife and let the moment be what it was. James Barker Sr. came into the room. Sarah handed her father-in-law his grandson. He took the baby. He looked at the baby's face. He looked at it for a long time. Then James Barker Sr., the man who had shaken Margaret's hand on her arrival, and said, "Ma'am," in a voice carefully calibrated to neutrality, who had passed the butter and held the door and maintained a careful distance, began to cry. Not dramatically, not with any performance. Just quietly, in the way of older men, the emotion arriving without announcement, moving down a face that had been set in its expressions for 62 years. Margaret watched this from across the room. She said nothing. She understood what she was seeing. The baby in his grandfather's arms had accomplished in 30 seconds what 9 months of patient effort had not. William looked at his father. He looked at Margaret. She gave him a slight nod. Some distances close on their own timeline. The years settled into their shape. 3 more children came. Elizabeth in 1949, Thomas in 1952, and Sarah in 1955, named for her grandmother, who received this news with the composure of a woman who doesn't show strong feeling in public, but was clearly moved. The farmhouse filled with the particular life of a home that is fully inhabited. meals, disagreements, homework, repairs, the seasonal rhythms of a working farm. Margaret taught her children German. They learned it the way children learn things available only at home, with ease in childhood, with varying retention later, with the particular warmth that comes from a language associated with a parent. But they were American, fully naturally, without complication. She made sure of that. The dual inheritance was hers to carry. Theirs was simpler, and she was glad of it. She never forgot Torgau. She had not expected to. On quiet evenings after the children were settled, she would sometimes sit on the porch and be in two places at once, in Oklahoma, in the warm dark, listening to the night, and simultaneously in a ruined square, kneeling, her hands moving through ash and grain. She had been someone there before she was who she was here. That person had not disappeared. She had simply become this person instead, the way a river changes as it moves through different country, carrying everything that came before. William would find her on the porch, sometimes her eyes somewhere else. He would sit beside her. She would come back. She always came back. In 1955, a letter arrived from Torgau, from Ernst Schmidt. His handwriting was older, slightly less precise, but the formal English unchanged, learned from books, particular in its construction. He wrote that the town had been rebuilt, that new buildings stood where the ruins had been. He enclosed photographs. He wrote that he thought of her often, that he hoped she was well, that he remembered the afternoon in the square when a sergeant from Oklahoma had sat in the rubble and watched a woman eat chocolate as if it were important information about the nature of people. Margaret read the letter twice. She looked at the photographs for a long time. The town in the photographs was functional, rebuilt in the architectural style of Soviet East Germany, efficient, without ornamentation. The square had been paved. The bakery was gone entirely, replaced by an apartment block. The church where she had been married had become a culture house, a cultural center. She looked at it without grief. The grief was already old. What she felt was something closer to a final confirmation that a place had continued without her, had transformed into something entirely unrelated to her memory of it, had become the past in the most complete way possible. She put the photographs in the tin box with William's letters and the chocolate wrappers and Schmidt's original statement. She wrote Schmidt back. She told him about the children, about the farm, about Oklahoma, about James Friedrich, 8 years old, already showing signs of his grandfather Heinrich's instinct for order and precision. She told him she was happy. She wrote those words carefully and meant them completely. In the spring of 1985, William told her they should go back. They were on the porch. He was 71. His heart had been giving him difficulty. The doctor had used language that indicated a specific and measurable situation, though doctors rarely stated the number directly. He was tired in the way of a man who has spent a long life working and has recently begun to feel the accumulated weight of all of it. Back where? She said. Torgau. You should see it again. She was quiet for a moment. For 40 years she had not gone back, had not considered it. Germany was the past. Oklahoma was home, but she looked at his face. She understood what he was offering her. Not tourism, not nostalgia. Something more specific, the chance to close something properly before closing became unavailable. All right, she said. They flew to West Berlin in June, then navigated the paperwork for entry into East Germany, the DDR, the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, one half of a country divided by decades of Cold War. Travel to East Germany in 1985 required advance applications through consular channels, documented purpose, approved itinerary, and a transit visa issued by DDR authorities. It was achievable, but deliberately procedural in the way of systems that want you to understand the access is permitted rather than assumed. They managed it. They had both navigated difficult paperwork before. The train from East Berlin to Torgau ran through landscapes familiar to Margaret in geography and foreign in everything built upon that geography. The DDR had rebuilt with Soviet architectural principles, functional, rectangular, without the kind of detail that serves no practical purpose. The towns had been made livable and had not been made beautiful. Torgau appeared through the train window, looking nothing like her memory of it. She had not expected it to. But expectation and experience are different things, and the complete transformation of a place held in the mind for 40 years produces something specific, not grief, not disappointment, but a final confirmation. The past was past. It had become something else entirely. They walked through the town with a DDR-approved guide who maintained a careful professional distance. The square was paved. The bakery site was the apartment block she had seen in Schmidt's photographs, now 30 years old. The church, her church, where she had stood in a borrowed blue-gray dress and said 2 sentences that changed everything, was a Coulter house. A banner outside advertised a concert series. William held her hand. They walked without hurrying. She stopped at the apartment block. She stood on the pavement above where the cellar had been, the cellar where she had collected rainwater in a tin bucket and rationed 3 potatoes across 9 days and lay on the floor waiting for herself to stop. She stood there for a long time. William stood beside her. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. An old woman had been watching them from across the street. She crossed over, moving slowly with a cane, and spoke in German. "Are you Margaret Fischer?" Margaret looked at her. The woman was in her late 40s, gray-haired, with tired eyes, and a face that had come through a hard life with the competence of someone who had no alternative. There was something faintly familiar in it, the way a face seen in childhood becomes uncertain in memory, but doesn't entirely disappear. "I was," Margaret said. "You were my teacher." The woman's voice was working to stay even. "I am Greta. Greta Hoffman. You taught me to read. I was 8 years old. I had difficulty. You stayed after school on Tuesdays." Margaret looked at her. Greta Hoffman, a small girl with braids who had found reading difficult, who had improved because someone had stayed on Tuesday afternoons. 40 years ago, in a school that no longer existed. "Greta," she said. "Yes." They talked for an hour. Greta told her about the town, who had stayed, who had gone, the decades of quiet reconstruction, the ordinary life that had been built on top of extraordinary loss. She told Margaret about her own family, her work, the shape her life had taken. When they said goodbye, Greta held Margaret's hands. "You were right to leave," she said. "There was nothing left here for anyone." She said it simply, as a fact that had had 40 years to become settled. Margaret held her hands and thought about a small girl with braids on a Tuesday afternoon, about how ordinary patients, staying after school, believing a difficulty could be overcome, moves forward through time in ways impossible to predict, about how it arrives 40 years later in a woman on a pavement in East Germany, still present, still carrying what it had meant. She thought, "I was that girl once too." Someone stayed. That evening, in a hotel room in East Berlin, Margaret sat by the window while William slept. She looked at the divided city. West Berlin visible in the distance as a different quality of light, brighter, the particular glow of a place with more possibility running through it. The wall was not visible from this window, but its presence organized everything, the way an unseen fact shapes the landscape around it. She thought about Schmidt. His letters had grown shorter over the years. His last 4 years ago had been 3 sentences. He was well. His wife had gone. He was glad of good things. She thought about Danny Reeves. 2 months ago, a letter had arrived from Brooklyn. Danny's wife, Eleanor. Danny had passed in 1983. She wrote, "Heart, quick, the way these things sometimes go." She had found Margaret's address while going through Danny's belongings after finally clearing the apartment and had wanted to write. She said Danny had mentioned William and Margaret occasionally over the years in the way men refer to things they consider significant without having the words to address them directly. The last time, maybe 2 years before he passed, he had said, and she wrote it down because she wanted it to be exact. He had said, "That German woman Bill married. She was all right. She was more than all right." Margaret had read this letter at the kitchen counter in Oklahoma. She had read it twice. Then she had put it in the tin box. It was in her bag now. She was in Berlin, 40 years from where it had started, thinking about a man from Brooklyn who had dealt cards on a section of rubble in the summer of 1945 and had improbably become part of the architecture of her life. She thought about the way things connect across time, the way a small action, a chocolate bar, a Tuesday afternoon with a struggling student, a signed statement, a hand of gin rummy, extends forward without the person performing it being able to see where it goes. How the effects of what we do outlast our ability to observe them. William was breathing steadily behind her. She had been hearing him breathe in the dark for almost 40 years, and it had never stopped being something she was glad for. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe. William passed in 1989. A Tuesday morning in October in the farmhouse where he had been born 75 years before. He was in the bedroom with the window that looked out over the wheat fields. It was fall. The harvest was in. The fields were pale gold and then brown, the wheat cut down, the earth waiting. He passed looking at it. His children were there. Margaret was there. He had asked her the week before if she was all right. Not about his health, about herself. She had said yes. He had looked at her the way he looked at the wheat fields in autumn, taking stock of what was there, what had been grown, what would carry forward into the next season. Quietly, without hurry, making sure nothing was missed. She held his hand. She kept holding it for a while after. The room was quiet. Outside, the October light moved slowly across the wheat fields, golden clear, the way Oklahoma light is in autumn when the sky reaches that exact specific blue she had never seen anywhere else in all her years. Margaret lived another 16 years. She passed in the spring of 2005 in the farmhouse at 83 years old. The wheat was just beginning to green. Her children were there. 12 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren. James Friedrich, who was 58 and had run the farm for 20 years with the order and precision of a man who had inherited his great-grandfather's instinct without knowing its origin. Elizabeth, who had become a teacher. Thomas. Sarah, who had her grandmother's eyes, pale blue, very light, startling in their directness. She went in the morning in the room where James Friedrich had been born during the ice storm, in the bed where she had slept for almost 60 years. She was not afraid. She had said this to Elizabeth the night before, simply as a fact worth conveying. The obituary in the local paper was brief. Margaret Barker, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, preceded in death by her husband, William James Barker, survived by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren. Services at First Baptist Church. Donations to the local food bank in lieu of flowers. It didn't mention Germany. It didn't mention the long months of waiting. It didn't mention a ruined square in Saxony or a tin box under a bed or a retired schoolmaster who had sat with a difficult request for a full day and then written the truth down and signed it. It didn't mention a chocolate bar or a woman who had weighed 78 pounds or the particular quality of April light on broken brick. But at the service, James Friedrich stood and told the story. Not all of it, not the parts too heavy to distribute. The essential truth. She had been lost. In every way a person can be lost. A man had found her, not by looking for her, but by paying attention to what was in front of him. And he had given her what she needed, which was not only food, though it was food, and not only safety, though it became safety, but the simple and lasting act of treating her like someone worth staying for. That was the beginning. Everything else followed. The farmhouse in Oklahoma still stands. Great-grandchildren who never knew the war run across the wraparound porch. They speak English without accent. They know the story the way people know stories that happened before them as inheritance. as something that explains the particular shape of who they are without quite being real in the way that lived experience is real. In the spring, the wheat comes back. It always comes back. You plant it in autumn and it goes quiet through the cold. And then in April, without announcement, without drama, simply because it is what wheat does, it begins to green again. Margaret knew about this. She had watched it for almost 60 years. She had found it every spring quietly remarkable, that something planted in cold ground could rest through the worst of the winter and return, that patience and time and the faithful maintenance of conditions for growth, that these things were enough. The square in Torgau is paved over. The bakery is gone. The church is a concert hall. But James Friedrich runs the farm with the care of a man who inherited a quality he cannot name. Elizabeth teaches school with the patience of a woman who stays after class because some things are worth the time. Thomas's youngest daughter keeps a tin box on her shelf which holds letters and photographs and 2 chocolate wrappers so old they have become nearly translucent, and she doesn't know exactly what they are, but she knows they matter, and so she keeps them. And somewhere in all of it, in the wheat and the tin box and the woman who teaches school and the man who tends the farm and the great-grandchildren on the porch, somewhere in all of it, a sergeant from Oklahoma is still sitting in the rubble of a broken square beside a woman who has run out of reasons to continue. Still present, still asking nothing, still saying, in a voice that carries more than words can hold, "You're mine now." And she is saying back with everything she became, "And you are mine." That was the beginning. It never stopped being the beginning.